June 21, 1941. Brest Fortress on the western edge of Soviet Belarus. Major Viktor Yefimovich Zabolin made his last round after sunset, with his cap pushed back and his hands clasped behind him, as if he were inspecting a parade ground instead of a frontier fortress that had begun to feel too quiet. The air was warm. The river smelled of mud and summer grass. Somewhere beyond the barracks, a soldier had found an accordion and was forcing a cheerful tune out of it for men who wanted to believe the week would end like any other. From a distance, the scene looked ordinary. Up close, it looked rehearsed. Near a broken stretch of wall, he stopped and looked west, where the German side showed only a few weak lights. A sentry muttered that the border looked dead. What bothered Zabolin was not movement, but the lack of it. The roads beyond the river had been too empty in daylight. The dogs had gone quiet too early. One warehouse clerk had sworn he heard engines after noon, then laughed when no one backed him up. Zabolin told himself that nerves always sharpened before exercises and moved on. The cost of that choice was simple. He filed a warning under habit instead of action. At the regimental office, he found the political officer still awake, smoking over paperwork with the patience of a man who mistrusted silence more than shellfire. The officer asked whether the major intended to sleep in uniform again. Zabolin said no, though both men knew he probably would. Then the officer asked, almost casually, what he would do if war started before dawn. The phones went dead, and the orders never came. Zabolin looked at the maps pinned to the wall, at the neat colored lines that assumed time, sequence, and authority. He said that dying was simple enough. Deciding without orders was harder. The political officer laughed and said that an officer who waited for permission to think was only a clerk with shoulder boards. The remark was meant as a joke. It landed like a warning. After midnight, Zabolin wrote to his wife because writing steadied his hands. He described the weather, the mosquitoes, and the absurd rumor that the Germans were spending their weekend drinking beer on the other side of the line. He wrote that things were calm, and that perhaps all the talk of war would pass like the last scare. It was a letter that could survive censorship and worry. It concealed the one thing he believed most strongly. If war came, it would come without warning and without time to explain anything. Before lying down, he checked 3 things in the dark. He looked once at the field telephone. He touched the pistol on the table. He unfolded the fortress map and stared at the eastern sector before folding it again. The old eastern fortification had thick walls, broken chambers, and a well. It was not good. It was simply the only place on the ground plan that looked as though men might go on existing there after the first shock. He slept with a route already forming in his mind. At 3:15, the fortress ceased to be a fortress and became a target. The first German shells hit the barracks and warehouses almost together, as if a giant hand had smashed the central blocks flat in a single downward blow. Window glass burst inward. Brick dust filled the air. The office door jumped off its hinges and fell across the floor. Zabolin was awake before the second impact, already reaching for his pistol as plaster rained down his collar. The communications runner arrived with blood on one sleeve and no helmet. He shouted that the regimental lines were dead, the divisional lines were dead, and no one was answering from anywhere inside the fortress. Zabolin ordered a backup signal sent by runner to the neighboring positions, then changed the order halfway through because another strike tore open the courtyard and scattered the men who would have carried it. He grabbed the field telephone himself, cranked it, listened to static, and heard only a metal hiss. In that moment, the last thread tying him upward dissolved in his hand. Outside, fire was already running along the roof lines. One shell had smashed a supply shed. Another had cracked open officers' quarters where families had still been sleeping. Men stumbled through smoke, carrying rifles without bolts, boots without laces, blankets, pails, photographs, anything their hands had found before their minds caught up. Zabolin crossed the yard low and fast, checking instinctively where the pattern of impacts was walking. This was not warning fire. The Germans were hitting the command nodes, the barracks, the stores, the crossing points, the places men would run when they wanted orders. Understanding that meant understanding one more thing. Any man who kept waiting for clarification would die in place. At a breached wall, he found his youngest lieutenant trying to organize a dozen men toward the main gate. Their faces were white with dust, and one of them kept asking where the division was, as if the division were a building from which someone would emerge with a list and a whistle. The lieutenant said the only chance was to break out and rejoin the main force before the Germans sealed the roads. Zabolin looked at the gate line, then at the shell bursts still falling there, and saw bodies already lying in the open where earlier runners had tried that route. A shell landed close enough to spray them all with gravel. One sergeant dropped where he stood, folded under by a fragment through the throat. The lieutenant froze. So did the others. Zabolin pointed east and said they were moving to the old fortification. Someone called it cowardice. Someone else said the main body might still be holding outside. Zabolin snapped that a road under observed fire was not a road but a slaughter pen, and that any man who wanted to die for a guess could do it after helping carry the wounded. Shock finished the argument faster than authority could have. They moved in bursts through smoke and broken arches, dragging crates, lifting the dazed, shooting only when shapes appeared too close to mistake. Zabolin ordered them to take men first, then ammunition, then medical packs, and to leave paper records where they lay if a choice had to be made. By the time they slammed themselves inside the battered eastern sector, they had brought 82 people with them. 12 were badly wounded. Their ammunition averaged 30 rounds per rifle. There were 17 grenades gathered from pockets and smashed lockers, 2 boxes of compressed biscuits, and half a barrel of water. A woman clutching 2 children had been carried in during the scramble. An old man had hobbled after them. A young nurse from a shattered medical station had attached herself to the fortress doctor and was trying not to cry while she sorted blood-soaked bandages that no longer had any clean side. One soldier asked the question the others were holding back. How long were they supposed to stay? Zabolin looked at the calendar still hanging crooked in a side room, its square showing June 22nd, as if the day had any reason to remain ordinary. He said they would hold until orders came. Relief passed through the room at once. Men can carry almost any burden for a while if they believe someone above them has already decided when it ends. Zabolin knew no order would come. He had just tied the strength of the group to a lie he would now have to keep feeding. The first full day in the eastern fortification was spent turning a heap of survivors into something that might still answer to command. Zabolin reassigned gunners who had lost their crews, riflemen who had lost their platoons, and a cook whose officer was dead and who still had the steadiest hands in the room. He cut firing sectors into the walls, posted watches, rationed water by cup, and ordered that every round fired be accounted for by target and reason. The doctor objected first to the civilians. A child drank as much as a wounded man and did not stand a watch. The old man could not carry rubble, much less a rifle. The woman's youngest boy had a fever. Zabolin listened, then said they would all stay and each would get a ration, even if it meant every fighter had less. The decision angered men whose throats were already tightening with future thirst, but no one challenged him openly after that, because they saw him cut his own ration first. He drank last, ate last, and took the worst sleeping place against a cracked wall where dust sifted down every time artillery fell somewhere else in the fortress. Authority stopped resting on rank alone and began resting on what his body would absorb before theirs. By the second night, the shelling had moved westward with the main German advance, and the eastern sector dropped into a tense quiet. A patrol sent to feel the rubble line came back with 2 clips of rifle ammunition, a German bread pouch, and the news that the enemy seemed to think resistance inside the fortress had collapsed into isolated pockets. Zabolin listened, then began organizing small, deliberate raids. They would strike only when a target offered ammunition, food, or confusion. They would never all go at once. One pair of soldiers took turns firing the same rifle from two positions in the rubble, so that a German reconnaissance team thought it was receiving fire from a section-sized force. 3 enemy scouts fell, and the rest pulled back. That night, another group stripped pouches from the dead and came back with cartridges, dark bread, and a canteen still half full. Men who had been staring at walls all day suddenly spoke with something like energy. The eastern fortification had not become strong. It had become dangerous enough to imagine itself alive. A young Ukrainian private with a harmonica began to play during the hours before dawn, when the body is coldest and the imagination weakest. He played old songs softly at first, then louder when the others smiled despite themselves. The sound moved through the broken chambers and out through shell holes into the night. Somewhere outside, a German voice shouted in irritation. Several of the men laughed for the first time since the bombardment. Zabolin told the private to save his strength and save the music for men who were going to live to hear it properly. The order restored silence. It also revealed what Zabolin understood better than they did. Music could make a man remember tables, kitchens, wives, and roads. Men who remembered too clearly sometimes stopped fighting. For a week, the eastern fortification lived by theft, silence, and misdirection. Zabolin moved his shooters often, limited fire to moments that would sound larger than their real numbers, and made sure every patrol returned with at least one practical gain. The effect was a fragile illusion that the line inside the ruins was holding. Illusions, like stored water, are most dangerous when men begin treating them as permanent. The break came on June 30th. It began with mortar fire that was too concentrated to be another probing sweep. Then came armor noises from the approaches and the unmistakable wet roar of flame projectors somewhere near the collapsed outer wall. German forces that had previously left the eastern sector to be reduced at leisure had now come back to finish it methodically. The first armored vehicle ground into view through dust and shattered masonry at an angle that put its gun against the weakest surviving stretch of wall. Men fired anyway, because men always fire at what is coming straight at them, even when reason says bullets are only noise. Zabolin waited until it was close enough that missing would be a moral failure rather than a technical one, then led 2 men forward under cover of a collapsed arch with bundled grenades and an anti-tank charge recovered days earlier from a dead engineer. They disabled the vehicle and forced the Germans to pull back from the immediate breach. By nightfall, 12 more defenders were dead, and the wall would never again hold like masonry instead of rubble. The young lieutenant died during the same action, hit while trying to reposition a machine gun that had already burned 1 crew and jammed twice from grit. He had been married only weeks earlier. Zabolin saw the body after the firing slackened and had no speech for the men looking at him. He ordered ammunition cut again. 5 rounds per rifle would be the base issue for the next phase. At dusk, the doctor reported that the dressings were nearly gone and the water reserve would last perhaps 3 more days if everyone obeyed the new ration exactly. The eastern fortification had repelled an assault. It had also crossed into a war of counting single cartridges and single swallows. After that, the fortress no longer fought in dramatic surges, it eroded. A sniper bullet through a loophole killed 1 man because he stayed in the same firing notch too long. A shell fragment opened another from shoulder to hip while he was carrying bricks. A sentry, exhausted beyond shame, fell asleep against a wall and was found at dawn with his throat cut. The political officer who had once accused Zabolin of preparing to hide in the eastern sector died the same way after volunteering for a night watch no one wanted. In the first week, he had argued slogans and aggressive action. By the second, he was carrying the wounded and boiling dirty cloth. Zabolin stood over the body for a moment, then took the next watch himself. 1 more voice for doctrine was gone. What remained was what men could prove with their own bodies. The old well failed on July 5th. 1 bucket came up foul with grit and a chemical stench. Another showed a sheen on the surface that none of them trusted. Whether the Germans had poisoned it or debris had turned it bad no longer mattered. Water ceased to be a ration and became a memory. Lips split, wounds stopped closing. Men began glancing at shadows, as if dampness might be hiding there. The doctor tried to keep medicine in the world after medicine itself was gone. She amputated blackened tissue with a blade boiled in filthy water and had wounded men bite wood because there was nothing else to blunt the pain. Zabolin held one man's leg through the procedure while the stretcher hammered against the wall from his shaking. Some of the wounded lived another day or two. That was all the treatment could buy. The old civilian died next. Before he went, he pushed into Zabolin's palm a medal that had belonged to his son, killed in another war before this one swallowed the fortress. He asked Zabolin, if he ever got out, to find the son's widow in Minsk and give it to her. Zabolin nodded because dying men deserve promises whether or not the world will allow them to be kept. By then, the woman's younger child was no longer crying. That should have made the room easier to bear. It made it worse. Silence from a child means the body has chosen economy over protest. 2 riflemen slipped out one night without permission. No one knew whether they had planned it for days or decided in a single thirsty hour that enough was enough. They were spotted outside the sector and shot before dawn. In the morning, the Germans hung the bodies where the defenders could see them through a breach. It was an enemy message and an internal one at the same time. There might be no honorable route out, and no practical one either. When the doctor came to Zabolin after that and showed him the pistol round she had saved for herself, she did not do it theatrically. She spoke almost apologetically, like a woman admitting to hidden bread during a famine. She said she wanted one decision left that belonged to her. If Zabolin ordered her to surrender the bullet, he would be claiming authority over the last private boundary a human being can hold. If he allowed it, he was admitting the fortification had entered a place where death had become part of planning. He told her to keep it, but not yet. That same night, the harmonica boy played again. He should not have. Everyone knew it. The sound could guide a shot as well as any lantern. But thirst, sleeplessness, and grief sometimes bend men towards the one forbidden thing that proves they still contain preference. He played the opening line of the Soviet anthem, not loudly, just enough that the notes bounced from broken walls. The first phrases came clear. Then the rifle cracked from outside and the music stopped in the middle of a breath. Zabolin was the first to reach the body. The private had fallen sideways against the masonry, the harmonica in the dust by his hand, blood already running into the grooves of the cracked floor. Zabolin picked up the instrument and put it in his pocket. He said nothing. With that small movement, he took charge of the last piece of ordinary life left in the eastern fortification. By July 16th, the place had passed beyond starvation into disintegration. There was no food worth counting. There was no clean water. The woman wandered once through the chambers carrying the body of her dead child, with a face so empty that several soldiers turned away rather than see what complete exhaustion does to grief. One of the wounded begged for the doctor's saved bullet. Another begged for river water from a route no one could reach alive. Zabolin sat with his back to the wall, and for the first time allowed the thought to form fully. Perhaps command had ended days ago, and only inertia remained. He did not sleep that night. He fingered the old man's medal in one pocket, and the harmonica in the other, as if between them they represented the entire charge the dead had laid on him. By dawn, he had made no new plan. He had only refused to make the one plan that would simplify everything. The Germans provided the next test before noon. A voice came first, amplified and oddly formal, carrying through the rubble from outside the ruined walls. A translator repeated the message in Russian. The defenders had held for nearly a month. The Soviet state had abandoned them. No one was coming. If they surrendered now, their lives would be spared. The words did not cause panic. They caused stillness. because nothing weakens a group faster than hearing its secret fear stated aloud by the enemy. The remaining soldiers looked at Zabolin. What their faces asked was simpler and more dangerous than whether they should surrender. They were asking whether everything endured up to this point had been endurance towards something or merely delayed dying. For weeks, he had held them together with the promise of orders that would never arrive. He could not use that lie again. He took the harmonica from his pocket and held it out to the nearest rifleman, a man who had spoken the previous night about the uselessness of dying underground for ruins. Zabolin did not offer him a weapon. He offered him the one object in the fortification that still belonged to memory rather than battle. He said that any man who wanted to go could go. He would not stop them. But he himself had taken too many men into the eastern fortification on his own decision to walk out now, while they were still unburied around him. The rifleman looked at the harmonica, then at the major, then at the floor, where dust had layered itself over blood in so many thin films that one could almost read time in it. He pushed the instrument back into Zabolin's hand and said he had made promises too. Another man, whose leg wound had gone bad days before, laughed once through cracked lips and said that since the Germans had remembered them at last, he saw no reason to reward the effort by going out politely. It was not zeal. It was consent. Every man who remained had now made the decision as himself. Zabolin stepped close enough to the breach that the men outside could hear him without the amplifier. He answered in Russian that they needed no guarantees, and that if the Germans wanted the eastern fortification, they could come and take it. There was a pause long enough to make the reply feel absurdly civilized. Then the translator said the message was understood. From that point on, the struggle could no longer be mistaken for a trapped unit waiting for rescue. It had become witness made public. The last assault began before dawn on July 18th, and did not so much start as intensify. Fire was used against every chamber that still offered shadow. Rubble shifted under repeated impacts until familiar corridors no longer connected where memory said they should. Zabolin pulled the survivors inward chamber by chamber, never because retreat offered victory, only because each inward step forced the attackers to pay again. The battlefield shrank from a fortification to a cell of smoke and heat. The doctor used her final pistol round not on herself, but on a German soldier who lunged into a smoke-thick room before seeing how many wounded were still in it. The shot threw him backward into the doorway and bought perhaps 20 seconds, which in that phase of the siege counted as an hour. A moment later, a bayonet found her under the ribs. She slid down the wall, looked once toward Zabolin, and was gone before he reached her. 2 riflemen detonated their remaining grenades when German infantry crowded a collapsed passage. The blast killed them and several attackers and filled the chamber with brick dust and screams. There would be no reserve after that, no second team, no one left to repeat the act in another corridor. By the morning of July 23rd, the eastern fortification had contracted into a cellar room blackened by smoke and open to daylight only through a rent above. Zabolin was alone there, though alone in such places only means no one living is still answering. He had been wounded more than once, was running fever, and could not tell whether the wet on his sleeve was old blood or new. His pistol was empty. He knew it, because he had checked, then checked again, as if disbelief might manufacture a cartridge. German soldiers entered carefully, the way men enter a room that has already killed enough of their companions to deserve superstition. One private raised his rifle at once. An officer stopped him with a hand against the barrel, whether from discipline, curiosity, or reluctant respect, Zabolin could not know. The officer asked in rough Russian if he was alone. Zabolin did not answer. He was looking past the man toward the opening above, where sunlight cut through smoke and made the dust glow. He lowered the empty pistol slowly. Not because he accepted the German's claim to the room, not because he mistook an empty weapon for anything, but an empty weapon. He lowered it because the posture had already done its work. Everything the eastern fortification had held for 32 days was now leaving the ruins in the body of a single exhausted man. When they lifted him from the cellar and brought him into the open, he saw the fortress as the Germans saw it at last. Smashed walls, burned timbers, cratered courtyards, the geometry of official power turned into random heaps of brick and iron. German soldiers gathered to look. Some had expected a battalion, or at least a company, to be responsible for the stubbornness of the place. What they saw instead was a gaunt major with dried blood on his face, barely able to stand, eyes sunk deep from thirst and exhaustion. He kept one hand closed as they moved him. Inside it, pressed hard enough to mark the skin, was the old civilian's medal. He had not delivered it. He could not know whether the widow in Minsk still lived, whether Minsk still resembled Minsk, whether any promise made before July had survived July. One object had remained unlost. It carried the weight of every task impossible to complete. In the prison camp, years that followed, he would survive by the kind of stubbornness that no longer looks heroic once the shooting stops. He would not know for a long time what had become of the eastern fortification in reports, who had remembered it, who had simplified it, who had turned 32 days into a line item or a rumor. He would eventually recover his name in the eyes of the state that had once vanished from around him. Honors would come late, as honors often do, when institutions need time to rearrange memory into something useful. They would not reopen a room where a doctor had worked without medicine, or a boy had played a harmonica once too often, or a mother had wandered with a dead child in her arms because there was nowhere else to go. Years later, when age had softened his face, but not the set of his shoulders, someone would place before him a harmonica recovered from the Brest museum stores, caked once in blood and dirt, before careful hands cleaned it for display. He would not ask who sent it. He would not play it. The larger battle around Brest Fortress had been decided long before he was carried out. His resistance did not reverse the German advance. It did not save the frontier or restore the dead. What it did was smaller and, for that reason, harder to erase. It kept one pocket of the world from consenting to silence. It forced the enemy to acknowledge that the place had not simply fallen and gone mute on the first day. Through thirst, collapse, fear, and isolation. One forgotten major, and the people who stayed with him preserved a single stubborn sentence: "We are still here." That is why the last shot at Brest matters less than the last refusal to disappear. Not every act of resistance changes a map. Some prevent silence from becoming the final authority.